The Celebration Bowl, the Black College National Championship, the HBCU Super Bowl, whatever you want to call it, is Jackson State versus North Carolina Central for all of the marbles. Oh yeah, it's Locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked on HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked on HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And now, of course, Sam Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald sports editor. Thank you for going on this journey with me, making Locked on HBCU your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. It just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. They have you covered this season with more odds, props, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Now, I want to talk about this big time matchup. It's Jackson State versus North Carolina Central. It's the Celebration Bowl. These two teams are very similar, have had not the exact same path here, but as far as talent-wise, very similar because they are star-studded, and that's one of the things that we're going to discuss in our second segment. But the biggest similarity, especially when we're talking about being star-studded, is the quarterback position. These are the two best players, the two best quarterbacks in black college football, period. Shedeur has been the best quarterback in the SWAC all year. Davius Richard has been the best quarterback in the MEAC all year. And with all due respect to anybody at Tennessee State, North Carolina A&T, Hampton, none of those quarterbacks have measured up to these two. These are the two best quarterbacks in FCS black college football all year long. These two teams have been, I don't want to say spearheaded by their quarterback, but has definitely had a big part of it. And that's our first matchup. Davius Richard versus Shedeur Sanders. And I know that's how we started the week, but that's how we're going to start off our finishing part of the week. Our last episode is going to start off with that same matchup, but instead of just focusing on the stylistic differences like we did in Monday's episode, and if you didn't have a chance to check that out, I really think you should because it was a lot of fun to do. But if you haven't, we're going to recap a little bit, and we're going to talk about how you stop them. That's the difference between today and this small part and then on Monday. So Davius Richard versus Shedeur is going to be an interesting matchup because whoever quarterback plays better likely wins this game. I don't know if there's a situation where Shedeur outperforms Davius Richard and Jackson State still loses or vice versa. If one of those quarterbacks has a noticeably better game, that team won that matchup. That's my prediction in it, right? But as far as stopping Davius Richard, you have to be prepared to stop him on the ground and through the air. But let's focus on the ground part because we're going to talk about passing with Shedeur. And it made me think, does Jackson State have a problem with their running quarterback? That's the question that you should ask. How do they fare against running quarterbacks? And if you look back at their last game against Southern, not so great. Lyndon McDaniel came in and he really had a lot of success on the ground. He had over 100 yards rushing. He didn't even start the first quarter. So it made me wonder, I have to look back. Is this an aberration? Is this the norm? I didn't think it was, but they definitely couldn't stop him. They didn't have an answer for McDaniel earlier in the game. So I go back and I look. You go against Hodge Malik Williams and Campbell. You go against Andrew Body at Texas Southern. This doesn't happen. It's just not a typical problem for Jackson State. So for that, I say, okay, this is an aberration. However, Davius Richard is better than all of those guys I named. Nobody on that list, and I love some of them players on that list. I don't think any of them have been better than Davius Richard this year, so he's going to be the best quarterback that Jackson State has faced all season long. So even if they don't have a problem stopping a running quarterback, or even if they have the blueprint to doing it, it doesn't mean it's going to work, especially against a player of his caliber, right? So that's something you have to watch. And what if you've seen something on film that nobody else had exposed? That's another thing. Maybe Glendon McDaniel might have found a hole, and now the North Carolina coaches and Davius Richard have been in that film room, and they said, you know what? This is what we got to do. As far as Shedeur, you got to put pressure on him. You got to make him uncomfortable. You got to make it to where he realizes that pressure is always going to be there, where he starts seeing ghosts. You got to get it to that point because you want to heat him up and you want to take away his players in the back end because they have a lot of talent in that back end, and you want to make sure that you are in some way taking away some of it. Got to make him uncomfortable, make him rush, make him feel the pressure, make him try to get out and run. I'd much rather making a starting quarterback not really feel comfortable in what his zone is. He can run the ball, but when it comes to what Shedeur's zone is, it's actually going to be passing. And then taking away the wide receivers for Jackson State brings me to my second matchup, and that's Khalil Baker versus the Jackson State wide receivers. In the back end, Khalil Baker is the only, I'll repeat it again, he is the only HBCU player to be named an AP FCS All-American. First team, the only one to have that distinction. And listen, the HBCU just, I'm speaking, in this group, and I'm grouping them into this bubble of players. But that's not even the important part. He's a first team All-American. He just so happens to be the only one. And I think that it just speaks volumes to how good his season was, right? He's been one of the best ball hawks in the MEAC covering that back end. And you look at him. Yeah, you got Willie Gaines, Shane Hooks, Dallas Daniels, Kevin Coleman, Travis Hunter occasionally. You have so many players who can make plays for Jackson State, but then in the back end, at least Khalil Baker can take away some of the big plays. Depending on the coverage they call, he might be in some more shallow coverages. He might be in some more man coverages. It doesn't have to be specific, and they're probably going to throw a variety of looks at Shedeur as well. But you just look at it and say, Khalil Baker is going to need to take away something. If you're going to make Shedeur uncomfortable, you have to take away something. And maybe you play more cover one. Maybe you drop him down into more of the 10 to 15 range so that the quicker passes are taken away better. And he can actually make plays on the ball there. At some point, Shedeur is going to test him. It's just a matter of what happens, But then our last matchup is Latrell Collier versus Aubrey Miller, linebacker for Jackson State. And for me, Aubrey Miller is the man on this defense. He is the leader, vocal, play. He all around sets the tone for this Jackson State defense, and he flies around. He always flies around the ball, across the century mark as far as tackles go. He's an impactful player, right? He's also an All-American. I don't think he was an AP All-American, but he was an All-American in a multitude of different publications. So that's the volume, or that also speaks volumes to what he does on the field. But then a lot of people look at Davius Richard when they talk about the running game for North Carolina Central, and they're rightful to do that. But at the same time, he ain't doing it by himself, and I don't know if he can do it without this guy. Collier is a player who he's averaging 5.5 yards a pop, and just for context, Jackson State has only allowed 2.9 a pop this year. I'm talking about yards per carry. So by Collier having a good season, by Collier having a good performance, it allows Davius Richard not to be keyed in as much, because if you know he's going to run the ball because he's clearly the best runner, well, now you can play on him. All right, I'm going to keep him from stopping you. Now you're going to make the running back. But the running back is good enough to where if you make the running back beat you, he can't beat you, averaging 5.5 a carry. So that's my three matchups. You got Davius Richard versus Shedeur Sanders, and just who's going to have the better game there. Then you have Latrell Collier versus Aubrey Miller, and that's going to help the running game. So even if you want to put focus on it, it's just about expanding the running game and opening up everything for Davius Richard and Collier. And then lastly, you have Khalil Baker versus the Jackson State wide receivers, because he is going to be responsible with taking off some of the weapons in Jackson State, even though he can't take away all of them. And going forward, we have our two storylines, and I'm excited for these. And one of them is just how star-studded this game is, and the other is why there's actually 3 teams involved in the Celebration Bowl. Before I get into that, however, today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. They have you covered this season with more odds, props, and lines than ever before. BetOnline is the #1 sports wagering website out there. They have all of the best odds, the best props, like I said, but then they also are going to have you educated. See, I've said it a million times, and I'll say it 1,000,010. I don't believe that bad bets, or I don't believe that uneducated bets are good bets. They just aren't. But with BetOnline, they're going to get you educated. They're going to make sure that you are on top of everything so that you know what you're betting on. And that's most important, because educated bets are good bets, and they help you make more money. And ain't that the reason you're putting your money down anyway? They have football, basketball, hockey, soccer, combat sports, esports, everything you could think of. They're the most versatile ones out there. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all of your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. As we keep on rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making us your first listen of the day every day. Now, for your second listen of the day, make sure you're checking out Locked On Sports Today with Peter Bukowski. He's going to be bringing in all of the local experts to break down the biggest and most important national stories on a daily basis. We're going to keep rolling with our Celebration Bowl coverage, and now we're switching gears into the storylines that I'm looking for. And these are even more interesting. I think that the matchups are great, but I think the storylines and the key to victory for me are my favorite parts of this game this week. Let's go ahead and start off with the Celebration Bowl storyline number one. Jackson State is out for revenge, period. This is a mission for them, and it has been since the game started. Matter of fact, probably since spring ball, this has been the mission for them. Get to this game and get your lick back. I know Coach Terrell said they knew Central was going to be in this game, but I think they were secretly hoping that South Carolina State would come back. I think that's the case because in this game, it's Jackson State versus the North Carolina Central Eagles and the ghost of the 2021 South Carolina State Bulldogs. You have to exercise that demon. That's why they're here. That's the unfinished business. That's what it is. Yes, Deion Sanders wants to ride with his guys. Yes, Deion Sanders wants to coach one more game. And even if that wasn't the case as far as them losing in last year's Celebration Bowl, I still think he would be coaching in this game. But the unfinished business that people are speaking on, it's not them having one more game to play. We need to avenge our loss from last year. We saw what happened. We were embarrassed, disappointed in how we performed in last year's game. Even in Deion's goodbye speech, Aubrey Miller stood up and talked about it. This is something that's been weighing on their brain. This is something that they've been looking forward to the whole time. This is the unfinished business. But when I look at this matchup, I can't avoid thinking that maybe they're still going to be thinking about this matchup 2021 as this game is going on. It's motivation, and it's okay. I expect it. If that's what gets you pumped up, that's what gets you pumped up. I don't think it's going to be too much. It's a balancing act. It's about thinking about it enough to keep yourself motivated and reminding yourself what you don't want to be at, but then also not thinking about it too much to where you lose track of the actual opponents. I don't think they're going to lose track. They've dealt with a lot this year, especially with Deion leaving. They've had enough. If they were going to crack under mental pressure, I think they would have done it by now. But that is still something that's going to be weighing on their conscience. And my second storyline is the fact that this is a very star-studded affair. And I don't know if everybody realizes it. I thought Coach Terrell did a phenomenal job in the presser just detailing how many similarities that these two teams have, because they're both star-studded teams. And it might not show because the box office aspect goes to Jackson State. The box office having Travis Hunter and Shedeur and Aubrey Miller, the fanfare, the coverage, the attention, that all goes to Jackson State. They win there. But if we're just talking about X's and O's and who's on the field, and we're talking about having stars, they had 17 all-MEAC players at North Carolina Central. You had 13 at Jackson State. This isn't a compare numbers or anything because there's more teams in one conference. But the fact is, they both had a lot of all-conference players. And then you get even deeper. You look at the superlatives. Jackson State had the Offensive Player of the Year in Shedeur Sanders. Well, Davius Richard was the Offensive Player of the Year for the MEAC. That's the quarterback for North Carolina Central. They both had the Defensive Player of the Year. Aubrey Miller for the Tigers. Khalil Baker for the Eagles. Then you look at the Coaches of the Year. Clearly, Trei Oliver, Deion Sanders, both Coach of the Year. Then you have the Rookie of the Year, and that's Kevin Coleman. But then you had the Offensive Lineman of the Year for the MEAC in Robert Mitchell. These are a lot of similarities, right? And I was listening to an article I was listening to an interview of Chuck Barkley, and he was talking about how the playoffs are for the stars. That's when the stars come out to play. And this game is no different. Do or die moments. This ain't even like basketball. This is football. Do or die. This is when your stars are supposed to step up. And I'm looking at the stars. I'm looking at Aubrey Miller to have a great game. I'm looking at Shedeur. I'm looking at Davius. I'm looking at Khalil. I'm looking at Mitchell and Coleman. And I'm looking at the coaches to do everything. And that's the beautiful part about it is these names that I'm listing, they're going against each other. Khalil Baker is going to be a huge part of taking away some of the threats for Shedeur Sanders. Even if they don't go head-to-head, and Shedeur will test them, but even if they don't go head-to-head a lot, it's still going to be a big part of it. You may never see Khalil Baker. If you never see Khalil Baker, that means he did his job. Aubrey Miller is going to have to get past Robert Mitchell to try to get to Davius Richard. These two coaches are going to have to coach against each other. So when you're looking at the star-studded cast for each of these squads, oh my God, I can't think of a better celebration bowl. These are the two teams who I felt coming into the season, or I'm not going to say coming into the season, but a couple of weeks into the season, I realized these will be the two representatives in the Celebration Bowl, and this is exactly what we got with a bunch of studs, and I can't wait. Now, going forward, we're going to have our key to victory. Like I told you, these are my two favorite parts, the storylines and then also the keys to victory. I love this, even more so than the matchup this time. But we're going to talk about that going forward on Locked on HBCU. Before I get into that, today's episode is brought to you by NHTSA, and there's no excuse in drinking and driving. It just isn't, because if you've been out kicking it, you're hanging with your homies, all right, I get it. You done had a couple of drinks. Know your limit, first off. And if you don't know and you feel like you've exceeded, call somebody. Call a Lyft. Call an Uber. Call a rideshare. There's so many avenues that you could. Even if you're not sure, even if you're on the fence, just call somebody. If you see somebody who you're hanging with who's drank too much, man, take the keys. It doesn't take much. They might be mad, but trust me, you rather them be upset at you than live with the consequences of maybe you don't see them again. Maybe they kill somebody. People think getting pulled over is the worst thing. That's the best thing. I'm happy when I see people get pulled over for driving drunk because I know exactly where they could have taken it. So it's very simple. Drive sober or get pulled over. There's really no excuse otherwise. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked on HBCU, I want to appreciate all of my segment 3 folks making it to the end of our very last game preview. This is exciting. Our last Friday game preview of the season. After this, we're moving on to basketball. But let's talk about our keys to victory. And for me, it's simple. Sitting here talking about it. Of course, execution isn't. But for me, sitting here talking about it, it's simple. Jackson State, play a complete game. Drop the coaches speak. Don't tell me you haven't played your best football. I don't want to hear any of that come Sunday. If we're hearing that come Sunday, I don't know if they won, because if you win, you're not sitting there talking about, we didn't play our best game, we didn't do this. And it could be coaching speak, right? It could be just trying to motivate your players to not get full of themselves and understand, because the narrative all year has been, we're not here, we're here to dominate. But it's often been attached to them not dominating, right? So I feel like every time that the coaches have been saying it, it's coming off a performance where they felt like, we supposed to be better. We supposed to do this, that, and the third. The one complete game that Coach Harrell says Jackson State played was against FAMU, and that's great, right? So you play the second best team in the SWAC, and you put together a complete game, and we saw what happened in that game. That's great. Bring back that week 1 magic. Well, now you're going against the best team in the MEAC. So you got to do the same thing. You have to come back with another complete game. And it's rare if you don't bring your A1 that the job ends well done. It's just rare in a game like this because North Carolina Central didn't make it here for no reason. This ain't no Rudy Pool. This is not a team that you can just kind of mess around and have lulls. And these are real analysis that he's given, right? I don't know if it's coaching speak. I really think he feels like they haven't played up to the par that they've set. They've been unsatisfied. And I don't know if you can walk out of this game unsatisfied and then also have a victory. Now let's flip to their opponent, North Carolina Central. For North Carolina Central, you have to play good situational football. You got to play good situational football. So you are the number 1 team in the FCS when it comes to third down percentage, right? You're phenomenal at that. You got to continue. And here's the reason. It's big for 2 reasons. One, Jackson State's the number 1 defense in third down percentage. So now you're going big on big. So now you kind of combating right here where this is your strength. This is their strength. You got to win out. Because you have to be able to sustain drives. You're not just going to be able to float through and get first downs on first and second down all the time. Not in games like this, not against opponents like this. It's just not likely going to happen. So you have to be aware of that. You have to be aware that we're going to be in some tough situations. Might even be in third and long. Well, you're second and fourth down conversion. So maybe if you even have to eat away from some yards. Don't be conservative in this 3rd and 13. Are we just going to run the ball? Take some chances. If it's third and long, try to go for it. Keep them on their toes. Don't let them relax. That's going to be important. And then also, you're one of the better red zone defenses. You only allowed 19 touchdowns. Jackson State is going to drive on you at some point. I don't think anybody's going to have their offense completely shut down. But at some point, Jackson State is going to drive on you. You have to make sure their 7s turn into 3s. And you have to make sure you're converting, but you have to make sure that their touchdown opportunities turn into field goal attempts. That's what you have to make sure. So that's the keys to victory. Jackson State, drop that coach's speak. Put together a complete game for the first time since week 1. And then for North Carolina Central, you want to make sure that your team actually plays good situational football in third down and red zone. Those things are going to be very important to sustaining drives and keeping points off the board for your opponents. We'll see what's going to happen. I can't wait to recap this game. I'll be back with a minute breakdown on Saturday after the game. And on Monday, we'll be here to recap it on our Monday episode. In the meantime, in between time, man, I appreciate y'all for making us your first listen of the day. And for your second listen of the day, make sure you're checking out Locked On Sports Today with Peter Bukowski. Until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.